Hello everyone, Professor Berninger here saying hello to you from beautiful Stuyvesant Landing in Stuyvesant, New York. I've come down today to this particular spot for two reasons. Number one, the train tracks behind me tie in with our little lesson on when lilacs last and dooryard bloomed. And looking in the other direction, the lordly Hudson River it's going to tie in with crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which we'll might talk just a little bit about today. But let's just start with a little talk about Walt Whitman, growing in my Walt Whitman beard here. This might be a good spot to drop in a few slides of Walt Whitman. And Whitman did love to have his picture taken. Especially for that time period, it was expensive. It wasn't like today with a phone or digital camera. You had to pay a photographer, and you had to go and sit there and have your picture taken. But he had, I don't know, dozens of photographs taken of himself. So a little bit of I say this in a nice way, an egomaniac, but not quite a megalomaniac. But he was as interested in other people and his connections to other people as he was in himself. So his sort of interest in others and connecting to them does balance out, I think, some of his maybe grandiose self-concept. But he did love to have his picture taken, and he always has his picture taken, and he's very, very casual. Shirt is opened, in stark contrast to, say, a photograph of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which I'll drop in here. Again, as contrasted, now you saw the very formal photo of Longfellow. We'll contrast that to the very casual, very self-consciously casual, everyday look of Walt Whitman again here. And it just speaks volumes about what Whitman, his self-concept, and how he really wanted to be the poet of the American people and of American democracy. And he wrote nonfiction essays about that as well. So really a larger-than-life figure in his own mind, pretty well known in his time, and his main emphasis with his poetry was to be not just write whatever you want, but to be free form, free verse, not sort of tied to the old forms of poetry. And that's what America was. He saw America as a free verse, as a free form sort of country. And he really celebrated the individual, but he also believed in our bond with each other too. So I want to talk a little bit about when lilacs last and dooryard bloom. Not a whole lot. I'm not going to go through the entire poem. It's rather long. But I just kind of want to hit some high points with you on it. So lilacs, as most of you know, they're a purple flower, beautiful smelling, and they bloom around here in late April or early May. In Washington, D.C., of course, lilacs bloom a little earlier, and this is important for the poem, especially one part of it. Flowering shrubs bloom earlier the further south that you go. And the tree color this time of year turns earlier the further north that you go. So when lilacs last and dooryard bloom is going to be in April, and in particular, this is an elegy. An elegy is a poem that is a sort of a tribute to someone who is dead. And this is Whitman's elegy to Abraham Lincoln, who he loved. Walt Whitman was a Civil War nurse. He didn't have any formal training, but when the Civil War came, he went to Washington, D.C. He helped soldiers write letters. He read letters to soldiers, and he would nurse the wounded soldiers in the hospital. So Walt Whitman, Civil War nurse in Washington, D.C., and he would have seen Lincoln riding his horse in Washington, D.C. So when lilacs last and dooryard bloomed, first line, when lilacs last and dooryard bloomed. So he's talking about, again, April 1865. And the great star, now the great star in this poem, as you saw from maybe your footnote, I have a footnote in my book, literally Venus, which is not a star, Venus is a planet, although it becomes associated with Lincoln himself in this poem. So, you know, many times if you look up in the sky, you can see the planet Venus. It's very, very usually the brightest thing in the sky. And Whitman here is associating Lincoln with Venus, Lincoln the brightest of the stars. And the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night. Of course, Lincoln is born in Kentucky, but really associated with Illinois, and that's where his body is going to be headed in death. I mourned and yet shall mourn with ever returning spring. Now what is spring associated with? Mourning? No, winter is associated with mourning. Spring is associated with the blossoming of life. However, every spring, when those lilacs bloom, telling us it's spring, Whitman will be mourning the loss of Lincoln, who I hope you know was assassinated on April 14th, 1865 by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater while watching the play. Anyone? What play was Lincoln watching? It was a British play called My American Cousin. Lincoln was shot in the head, was taken across the street and died in a bedroom there. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C., you could spend a month there going to museums and historic sites. Going to Ford's Theater is worth it. You can see a pillow with Lincoln's blood on it, and then to go across the street and be at the bed side where Lincoln died is a pretty intense experience. He was really a marvelous president and a thoughtful human being, an exceptional writer, really a person who saved our country. Ever returning spring, Trinity means three, sure to me you bring, lilac blooming perennial and drooping star in the west, and the thought of him I love. So the Trinity here, the threesome, is the lilac blooming and Venus, Lincoln, and the thought of him that I love. So Whitman sort of including himself there. O powerful western fallen star, O shades of night, O woody tearful night, O great star disappeared, etc. O harsh surrounding cloud that will not free my soul. So he moves on talking about the lilacs with its heart-shaped leaf. Lilac has a heart-shaped leaf of rich green, and the heart, of course, is a symbol of love, even back then. With many a pointed blossom rising delicate with the perfume strong I love. Lilacs are very durable as well. If you ever ride down a back road around here, you'll see a lilac bush 20 feet off the road. There used to be a house there. The house is long gone, but the lilac bush is still there. And my theory, they were often planted at back doors of farmhouses, like the house I grew up in, because in the springtime, the smells of the farm would be a little intense, and you wanted some lilac there at the back door to cover it. With delicate colored blossoms and heart-shaped leaves of rich green, a sprig with its flower I break. So Whitman, this poem, Whitman is breaking off a sprig of lilac for Abraham Lincoln. This poem is the sprig of lilac, the elegy for Abraham Lincoln. In the swamp and secluded recesses, a shy and hidden bird is warbling a song. Many people feel that Whitman is the bird, the poet. And very rare, this is very unusual for Walt Whitman, he's alone in this poem. Whitman is alone in this poem with his elegy for Abraham Lincoln and his thoughts of Lincoln. He's usually with somebody in a poem, usually sometimes with us, right? Then we move on into the second cycle, and this is why I brought you here today to the train station at Stuyvesant Landing. And we move into the second cycle of the poem, stanza 5. Whitman starts talking about the Lincoln death train. Abraham Lincoln, very famously, he was embalmed, one of the first Americans to be embalmed, so his body didn't rot, was put on a train, and the train traveled up from Washington, D.C. I'll drop a map in here of the Lincoln death train route. And the death train traveled up from Washington, D.C. It stopped in New York City, and Lincoln's body and its coffin was paraded through New York City. A young Teddy Roosevelt hung out his family's window in Manhattan and saw it. And of course, the Lincoln death train went right by here, 30 feet from where I'm sitting on the train tracks, right there. So the Lincoln death train, Lincoln's body passed right through here, and that's why I've chosen to come down here. Now, Whitman does this beautiful thing in the poem for you aspiring poets. This is really quite remarkable. Over the breast of the spring, the land amid cities, amid lanes and through old woods, where lately the violets peep from the ground, spotting the gray debris, passing the yellow-speared wheat, carrying a corpse to where it shall rest in the grave. So as the death train comes north, and it wasn't like, boom, get on and go. They got off, the body was on display. It was in Albany, on display so people could come in and pay their respects. It wasn't like a quick trip here. As the death train comes north from Washington, D.C. to Albany and then west, as you saw on the map, lilacs would have been blooming all along the way as the train came north, and other flowers would have been blooming. So Whitman sort of associates that, the blooming of the lilac as Lincoln passed through. Coffin that passes through lanes and streets through day and night. And it was a big deal. Many people came out for the to see Lincoln, or even to just see the train go by. Whitman does broaden this out, a poem for all of the dead. Nor for you, for one alone, blossoms and branches green to coffins all I bring, for fresh as the morning. So for all people he is writing this poem, but particularly Lincoln. And then we get into the thirds. This poem has, again, a few cycles to it, beginning with stanza 10. Oh, how shall I warble myself for the dead one there I loved? And how shall I deck my song for the large sweet soul that has gone? And what shall my perfume be for the grave of him I love? So it's a very self-conscious poem, where in Whitman's head as he thinks about Lincoln. Stanza 11, pictures of growing spring from farms and homes, with the 4th month eve at sundown and the gray smoke lucid bright, floods of yellow gold. So, and then we get to the end of stanza 11, it's the end of the day. So you have this sort of mixing, right? This weird mixing in this poem of rebirth and death. So spring is rebirth. The massive death of the Civil War, Whitman gets to that, right? Stanza 15, big jump ahead there. And I saw askant the armies, I saw as in noiseless dreams hundreds of battle flags, borne them through the smoke of battles, right? So, the Civil War, the southern states seceded, we had a 4-year war, and at least 600,000 Americans were killed, and probably closer to 750,000. Until recently, more Americans died in the Civil War than all other wars combined that America was a part of. That Americans died in wars. So that would be equivalent to, I don't know, 3-4 million people today if we had a Civil War when you adjust for population. So it was just a horrific event. So but out of that comes really the true, well, maybe United States. Before the Civil War, we viewed ourselves in many ways as individual states. But after the Civil War, people would say the United States is. Before the Civil War, it was the United States are, plural versus singular. Now we say the United States is, because we are one country. So we'll pick up more on this in our next Walt Whitman segment.